the individual mandate, less attention was given to the employer mandate and how it affects small businesses and low-wage workers. Some Wendy's and Taco Bell franchises are now cutting back workers' hours in order to avoid having to provide health coverage, a requirement of the health care law that goes into effect next year. The law will require businesses with more than 50 full-time employees to offer health care or pay a $2,000 fine for not doing so. Last year, the CEO of Papa John's, incidentally a top Romney donor, said the law would add 11 to 14 cents to the cost of every pizza and predicted many franchise owners would make workers part-time to keep costs down. The parent company for Olive Garden and Red Lobster has also begun hiring more part-time workers. According to the New York Times, restaurants and hotels are among the industries likely to be squeezed the hardest by the law because they are low-wage industries that do not offer coverage to most of their workers. However, a study by the Urban Institute said complaints of many business owners were unfounded. While businesses with 100 to 1,000 employees may see cost increases, large businesses were unlikely to be affected. And the Affordable Care Act, in many cases, actually reduces costs for many small businesses through tax credits. Joining us now from Washington is business and economics correspondent for Slate, the always brilliant Matthew Iglesias. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about this. In terms of the Affordable Care Act, the goal here was to get more Americans insured. This seems to be a residual, I don't know if it's a problem. Is it a trend? And how concerned should we be that low-wage workers already not exactly getting the best end of the stick, if you will, in the American economy, are getting further harmed by employers who are now trying to make them part-time workers to avoid having to cover their health insurance costs?
Well, there's a trend towards sort of trying to reclassify people as part-time workers to avoid paying them benefits. And one of the ideas of this provision of the law was to try to penalize employers who don't give health benefits to their workers. Unfortunately, because of the way it's drafted, they said if we're calculating, do you have over 50 employees, you can't just replace 50 full-time workers with 100 part-time workers. They do something called a full-time equivalence calculation. But then when the actual fine is levied, it's $2,000 per full-time worker. So it's created this huge incentive for employers to sort of cut people below the 30 hours threshold. You're seeing it from these fast food chains. We had a story yesterday about universities looking to do it with their adjunct instructors. And, it's something people should be pretty worried about because there's a clear financial incentive now for companies to rejigger and push people's hours down.
Andrew, so, what is there a business interest in actually providing health care coverage? I'll draw your attention to the USA Today editorial board writes, yes, the employer mandate will add to some companies' costs of doing business, and those costs, no doubt, will be passed along to customers. Papa John says the price of a pizza could increase. But is that such a terrible price to pay to ensure that some of the nation's hardest working, lowest paid employees will get health coverage they've never had?
No, it's not a horrible price to pay. It's 14 cents.
Yes.
It's 14 cents.
And will consumers say, okay,
and the consumers will say, fine, because guess what? You know what? It's a level playing field. Everybody's playing in the same place. Now, by the way, distinction between service industry like Papa John's and manufacturing. If you're manufacturing a car and you think you're competing against, or electronics, and you're competing against some other country where they're paying the people next to nothing, right, that's a different story. But the kind of thing we're talking about here is you're not going to Papa John's in China to get your pizza.
Right.
Right.
Or if you are, you're very wealthy. Incredibly wealthy.
And
so
the 14 cents is not a problem.
It's nothing. But so you're saying because the hospitality industry is governed by sort of different metrics.
It's different metrics. It's pathetic to hear these CEOs scream about this particular issue in that particular sector.
I of course, and we talk a lot about income inequality on this show, Ryan, and this sort of drew our attention back to the struggle of the American worker. And this weekend in the New York Times, Steve Greenhouse had a great analysis of what has happened to income and wages in this country. From 1973 to 2011, worker productivity grew 80%, while the median hourly compensation after inflation grew by just 1/8 that amount. And since 2000, productivity has risen 23%, while real hourly pay has essentially stagnated.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where this extreme inequality comes from, and the inequality pushes all the power to the top, and so they're going to continue to use that power to keep the poorest poor. Now, the question would be, does this harm them in competition in getting workers? Because it's much more of a pain to schedule a whole bunch of people for 14 hours a week than it is to have a good worker come in for 40 hours a week. And so the good workers are then going to gravitate towards places that are going to hire them at 40 hours a week, and the other places are going to have very transient employees, and they're in the service industry, so that's not necessarily going to benefit them.
Matt, where is the sort of American worker in this debate in terms of having enough of a voice to argue on his or her behalf?
Well, I mean, there's a much weaker worker voice, both because we've seen a real decline in the level of unionization in the country, and also because the unemployment rate is so high. I mean, one of the main reasons that the profit share of the economy has grown so enormously large over the past few years is that we've maintained this very high unemployment rate economy for years and years and years. So it's extremely difficult for people to bargain for better wages and better working conditions. I think Ryan's right that, as we return to full employment, it's going to be very difficult for employers to get away with these kind of games. I mean, workers don't like to be mistreated, and people are going to have some say in where they work. But as long as unemployment stays around 8%, as it's been for a long time now, it's very easy for bosses to sort of get over on people. And if the law isn't airtight, they're going to find ways to sort of push those costs down to their lowest paid employees.
Ironically, this is happening against the backdrop of corporate profits being as high as they have been in quite some time. In Greenhouse's piece, he writes, overall employee compensation, including health and retirement benefits, has also slipped badly, falling to its lowest share of the national income in more than 50 years, while corporate profits have climbed to their highest share over to that same period. I mean, we talk about where we are in terms of priorities here.
Well, the other thing is, I think we're at such an early stage here in terms of understanding what the Affordable Care Act is and what it's going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. We just got through the election where we kind of decided, okay, we're going to have this thing for a while. Now we're in sort of this implementation phase. I mean, another question that needs to be raised is how many of these states are going to actually put are actually going to do the Medicaid expansion?
Right.
How many of these states are actually going to put these healthcare exchanges into effect? You had some progress this week. I think it was Susana Martinez, a Republican out in New Mexico.
Jan Brewer.
Thank you. Jan Brewer out in Arizona saying she's going to do it too. So this might be the sort of thing where you're hearing, this is sort of the residual caterwauling almost from these CEOs and from Republican governors. We're going to fight this tooth and nail. And maybe a year, maybe 2 years from now, we stop hearing that and this becomes a little bit more standard.
Residual caterwauling, Andrew. Is it residual caterwauling? I like that you were saying for shame to corporate CEOs who are making this an argument.
It's a ridiculous argument. But can I just make one comment? Before you got onto this, you did talk briefly about the profits and the inequality issue. And there's one thing that we can't get away from, which is technology.
Right. Well, that's the productivity thing. Productivity doesn't necessarily mean higher wages.
But you saw American Express, for example, get rid of, I think, close to 5,000 people this week. And why? Because guess what? All of us are not calling the American Express number anymore to get our travel. We're doing it online. And so we all think technology is a great thing. But guess what? Technology is not always a great thing when it comes to jobs.
Absolutely.
And that's not going to be fixed by technology either.
When it's done in a system where all the profits can go to the top.
Exactly.
A sane society would say, well, everybody benefits by a more productive society, but that's not the society that we have.
It's a longer conversation, but anyway.
It is, and that is actually part of his story, which I encourage everybody to read in the New York Times, talking about productivity. The fact that robots are now on manufacturing floors is not necessarily a good thing for the American worker. They tried to replace me with a robot, but I have stood firm, everyone. Slate's Matthew Iglesias. Matthew, sorry we have to cut it off there. We hope to have you back sometime very